All right, gang, today I'm bringing you another auth video. Today we're going to jump in and have a look at Kind, which we've looked at before. But today I'm going to show you how to implement this in a Rails API. And it's quite generic, so that if you don't want to use Kind, you want to use something like Clerk or Auth0, you can use the same tools to achieve the results. So let's jump in and have a look. First things first, let's set up our new Rails project. I'm gonna just pull up my notes and make sure that I am telling you the right things. So to get started, we're gonna create a new Rails API. So you can see by this flag here. We're gonna call it KindAuth, the database Postgres, and we're gonna skip tests here. I'm actually not gonna use Postgres, so I'm just gonna rewind that. Let's just do that. Skip tests, because if we do write tests, we use RSpec, and we want it in API mode. So we're gonna hit that, let it do its thing, and bundle install all the gems, and we are ready to go. So let's go cd KindAuth, and now let's open code. What we wanna do here is we wanna set up Kind. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. So we need to have a Kind account. So I've already done that, but for you, you jump onto kind.com, start for free, sign up, create all your new organization, and you'll end up with something like this. So mine's called codetutorials.kind.com, right? Now that's your domain. So that's an important piece of this workflow. So from there, we're going to go into settings, and we want to create an API. That's Kind's being a bit slow. There we go. APIs, and we want to create a new API, which will be the KindAuth API. So to do that, you just hit add API, and you just give it a name and the audience. And the audience is this piece here. So usually that's a URL. I like to give that as a URL. So it could be api.myapp.com or whatever. And I just name it there. All right, so once we've set up the API, we can then go into back to home and go into our applications. So view details of here, and then we go into APIs, and now we can see we need this turned on. Okay, so make sure you turn that API. That is our audience. So a lot of these auth providers, or in OAuth, you'll have an audience, what the token that you're issued for. The audience of the API is the API you want to consume from. Okay, so you can see we have two different ones here. This is the Kind Management API. So if you wanted to programmatically create users or manage them, you use that audience. If you want to interact with our API, we're going to use this audience. Okay, so with that ticked off, let's move on to the next piece. So from there, we've enabled it. And what we need to also do, just make sure that inside of our app here, inside the Rails app, go down to the bottom here and the callback URLs. For now, I am doing the callback URL of Postman. I'm using Postman to test this. This will be, usually we're going to get a token from our front end. So it would be a React app or something, and we'd have that. So we would have the callback set to that. But in our instance now, we're just literally going to use Postman as our front end. And we just want to get the token out so that we can interact with our API. Okay, so make sure you set that up there. From there, we are now going to add some gems to our project. So let's jump back into VS Code, jump into the gem file, and then down the bottom here, let's chuck in these two. So we're using JWT gem, so that's for encoding and decoding JWTs, JSON Web Token. Then we have an HTTP client, which is a really simple HTTP client. All right, so now what we're gonna do is just go run here and we run bundle, and that'll install those gems for us. From there, let's run this little script. We're going to now add our credentials for Kind for our Rails app. So to run it, it looks like this. Editor equals, and then in quotation marks, we've got code wait. So we're gonna wait, VS Code's gonna wait for this. Rails credentials edit, and the development environment, okay? So I've showed this before, but yep, we trust this. This is where we can define environment variables. And these are all encrypted, so you don't have to worry about, and they actually get shipped with the application, but the keys do not. So you'll see here in config credentials, the development key is not committed to the repo ever. So we can share these amongst ourselves, but this file here is committed with the code. So it keeps your variables really clean and together. So you can see here, I've got the wrong audience. What we want here is our audience from our API. So we'll jump in here and we'll grab, it is this one. For me, that'll be different for you. paste that in. Now we need the domain and we need the client secret and client ID. So if you jump into the details piece here, you'll see domain. So we'll copy that, chuck that in there. And then we need client ID and client secret. All right, so you go and paste those in, and once you've done that, we're going to hit save and close. Once you've done that, you'll see here inside of the terminal, we'll have file encrypted and saved. All right, once we've saved our credentials, we can now set up our JWT parser. So what we're going to do here inside of the app directory, we're going to create a new file inside of new file integrations/kind/decode JWT.rb. That's our file. So it lives in a folder, integrations, inside of another folder called kind. And this is the way I like to structure integration. So any system we're integrating with, I like to have an integrations folder and then the name and then all the tools and utilities inside here. So in this file, this decode JWT file, we've got this code here. So the module's kind, the class is decode JWT, which matches the file name here. We were getting the JWT and the HTTP gems that we've installed earlier. Now we'll pass into this service the token, which is the JWT, and then we'll have a little action called perform. When we perform, we will validate the token that we pass in, and then we run through this code here. So I'll walk you through what we're doing here. So the first piece is we're getting the JWKS. Let's get a definition of the JWKS. So the JSON Web Key Set is a little object that shows signing algorithm and the keys that we can use to decrypt and make sure that the token hasn't been tampered with. This is an example of a JWKS.json. So you can see it's a public endpoint there. So you can see a JWKS here. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we don't understand or need to understand, but we got to see that it's RSA, RS256, and use the signature, okay? So that's what it looks like. That's what we're grabbing, and then we're using that to decrypt. So that's the first piece. We get the JWKS file. If it's a success, unless it's a success, we're going to return an error saying it's unable to verify. Then we're going to pass that hash because it's going to come in as a string, and we want to pass it as into a proper hash. It's a JSON string. We're going to symbolize the names, and then we're going to decode the token. Okay, and the decode the token uses the JWT gem. We decode, we pass in the token, some options here, and then we tell it what algorithm we want to use, what the issuer is, and then we're saying verify the issuer, what the audience is that we supply, and verify that. And then these are the keys, the JWKS keys that we want to use to do that. All right. Once we get our decoded tokens, we grab the first one, and then we're returning that it was successful, and then we're grabbing some things out of that token that we can use. So we're looking for the sub, which is basically the account ID. And then the SCP in the kind token is the scope, and then we pass through the whole data token there. All right, so that's the decode JWT service. So now what we want to do is we want to actually generate a JWT from kind. So to do that, I'm using Postman, but I'm sure you could use any other client that of your choosing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, just in an untitled new request, we're going to go new auth 2 authorization. And then we're going to say down the bottom here, we're going to configure a new token. So the token name is kind, because that's what we're using. Authorization code with PKCE. Authorize using the browser. There you can see the callback URL that we used in kind. And then here's the auth URL. So you'll see it's your domain name with the suffix of auth2/auth. And then the token URL will be the same, the domain name /auth2/token. Now you're going to put your client ID and client secret in there. So that's some part of it. Now we're going to have the challenge method SHA-256, and then the scope is OpenID offline email profile. A state is the state. We can just use anything here. I'm just using Postman state, and I'm sending the credentials in the body. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to add here in the auth request the audience, which is the API audience that we added earlier. So api.kindauth.app, and then I'm going to go get new access token. Right. This is going to let you sign in. And then when it's finished, because I've done this before, it's just throwing me back, and it's going to open Postman. And now you can see authentication complete. So in your instance, you'll need to log in. So now if I hit proceed, I now have an access token. All right, so if we grab that and chuck it into JWT.io, and this is a great debugger, we can do that and we can have a look what's coming in here, right? So you can see the algorithms RS256. Here's the audience that we're using, and in kind it's an array. And here you can see our sub, which is KP79. So that's the user ID. So if you jump into kind, make sure that you have a user set up before you run this actually. You can have a look here. If we go into this user, we can see there's that same ID, all right? So that's what we're getting here. That user there is the one that I logged in with, and those two things match, all right? So from there, we've now got our token. So if we grab that, we can now test our JWT decoder. So inside of terminal, let's run Rails console, all right? And now we're gonna say token is equal to, open a quotation and paste the token in. So now we've got our token. And then we're going to run our JWT decoder. So we're going to run kind, : decode JWT.new, pass the token in and hit perform. All right, there we go. So our decoder is working. You can see that there. Now, if we did something like, let's change this. Let's remove that A and see if we can still decode the token. False. So you can see that the token isn't able to be decrypted and it fails. So if I chuck that A back on, there we go. So we can see we can now decrypt this token and everything is working. So that's awesome. Let's move on to the next step. So the next step is we're going to add some models. So I'm going to exit terminal here. I'm going to go Rails G model user, and that's the user that will log in. And then we can also have Rails G model user account. Now I'm setting this up so that a user can have many accounts, and an account could be kind. And if you ever say, I need to change auth provider, I want to add a different method, you could just add that. Let's say it was you migrating to clerk, you could change that, or it just gives you flexibility instead of hard coding the account on the user. All right. So we're going to hit G model create user account as well. Now we're going to jump in here and have a look at our models. So the first one's the user model, and we are going to set it like this. A user has many accounts, and when you delete the user, we destroy those accounts. And it also accepts nested attributes for user accounts. That means that when you create a user, you can create the accounts at the same time. And you'll see why that's important in a second. Now with the user account, we're actually going to update the migration here. And we're going to just add some fields. So we're going to say user account belongs to user. It has a string called provider and has a string called provider account ID. So you imagine it would be user ID 1, provider kind, provider account ID, KP underscore whatever the ID is. Okay. Now we're going to update the model for that. So that's the user account model. We're going to say that the user account belongs to a user. It validates that provider account ID and user are all present before we create. Okay. So that's all good. So those models are set up. So now we need to run our migrations and set up our DB. So we're going to run Rails DB create and Rails DB migrate. Let's see if that works for me. Boom, there we go. So we've got our new databases, our SQLite databases, and it's created all the tables in there. Perfect. And we can test that these models are by running Rails C and then just going user.all. Nothing. Excellent. So that's working. Now we're going to create our service for kind, which is our find or create user service. Okay, so we're going to now create the kind service called find or create user. Now what this service does is, it actually should be renamed, that should be called services. And what this does here is, this service is in charge of, we're going to pass in a token or account ID from kind. Then we're going to look up in our DB and find that user. If that user doesn't exist, we're going to create them. So it's like an upsert. We're going to create that. So let's just drop that code in there. So you can see here, kind services find or create. What's the provider key kind? I've just set that there as a constant. We initialize with an account ID and then we run perform, right? So the user result is find or create user with that account ID. So here we can see it's very simple. Find the existing user. So we're joining the user accounts table, looking for the provider key with the account, finding the first result and returning that if we have it. Otherwise, we're creating a new user. And now you can see where we're using these nested attributes. So these are nested attributes for accounts. We're going to create a new user, and at the same time, we're going to create a new user account with these attributes. Okay? Then if we can't save the user, we're going to return the errors. Otherwise, we're going to just return the new user. All right? Simple as that. That's all done. All right, so quite straightforward. Now we're going to set up our controller. So inside of controllers, we're going to create a new folder, v1. So I like to version these things. And then we're going to create API controller.rb. All right, and that's going to look like this. So in here we have the module, so it's namespaced. It inherits from application controller, which is nothing right now. Before every action or every render, we're going to use call current user. So we always want to double check if we have a current user. If no bearer token's present, we're going to return no bearer token. If the decoded JWT wasn't successful, we're going to return that error. Otherwise, we're going to use our find or create user service. So I'll step through this. Bearer token is down here. And what this little or equals means is if this instance variable hasn't been set, then run this code. So we really just want to run this code. If we're calling current user multiple times, we don't want to be constantly doing the same work. This is a very quick method, but you can use it for something like this, where it's doing like a little bit more heavy lifting. We make sure we just run it once in the cycle. So now we're saying we're looking for request headers authorization. We're finding the bearer token, and then we're pulling out the actual token itself, right? And that's our bearer token. And then the decoded JWT is down here, and we are running our kind decode JWT method or service here to get that. And then here our user result is find or create user, which just calls our kind service and passes in the account ID, which is the decoded JWT account ID, all right? And then if there's no user result success, we return the errors, which is the user couldn't be created, etc. Or we return the data from that service, which is the user itself, all right? We'll save that off. Now we have to create our users controller. So inside the v1 namespace again, users controller.rb, very simple method, this one, v1, users controller, inheriting now from the API controller. It's inheriting all this methods here. We're just going to have a route called me, and that's going to return the current user. All right, simple. Inside of config, jump into routes, and now we're going to set up the routes for our controllers, right? So we've namespaced v1. We're defaulting the format to JSON, and then everything inside of this block would be v1/users me. So now we have a new route called v1 users route. So let's go Rails routes. You can see here, boom. So v1 uses me, routes to v1 uses me action there. Format JSON as a default. Excellent. We've got a route. There's one special thing that we've done here. Because we are using API in caps, we need to create an inflection. So if we jump into config, initializers, inflections, and just drop this in here, you can see that we're inflecting the acronym API. That just helps with like Rails, because Rails would look, when it's looking for the module, it's going to look for API like that, right? But we want to be API. It's because of the way classes are named and the camel casing. Not too important in this tutorial. Now what we should be able to do is if we grab this token here, now we open up a new request and we go into, a bit hard to see in Postman, I apologize. I don't know if I can make this bigger. There we go. Yes, I can. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to hit the endpoint, v1 uses me. We want to pass through the bearer token here, and we want to paste this into this token spot here. And then we want to run it. But do make sure we're running our server. So Rails S, now you can see it's running and booted, and hit send. And you can see what just happened. So if we look what happened, so we hit this get request, uses me. We selected try to find the user. Obviously nothing came out. Was looking for the account ID here. Then what it did is it said, okay, cool, let's create that user. And it inserted the accounts. It inserted into users and user accounts, and then it's returned that user for us with user ID 1. So just to make sure that we're not lying to you, you go into user.all. You can now see we have a user record. And if we do user account let's go first, you can now see there's now a kind account for that user. And that is how we can quickly and easily set up kind auth or any JWT auth that if you're using a service that provides, using it on the React front end, and you get given a JWT and you want to pass it up and authenticate that user on your API service in Rails, this is how you do it. So in the past, I would have had auth 0 here. And then it's very simple. All we're doing is we're swapping out that to auth 0, and we're making sure that we're getting the right route to the JWKS here. And that's really the only changes that you'd need for something like auth 0. And then here, this would be auth 0. And that's it. And then you'd be running with auth 0 JWTs. And it's a much simpler way, I find, than sometimes using the gems. And this way you just have full control and insight, and you can actually understand how this all works. But from here, we set up a front end. When we authenticate, we pass bearer the token just like you normally would. It hits the Rails API. Rails grabs that token, looks up the user, grabs the user. Now you have the user all throughout all your methods. So you can use things like Pundit to do authorization. Like this user, can they access these records, or are they authenticated? So you get all that power out of the box. Very simple, very quick to implement. Drop some questions down below if you need. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.